My name is Magdalena Kramer, and I'm the Associate Director for the Center for Values in Medicine, Science and Technology. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you here for our second lecture in the series of the Reimagining the Future, the power of imagination and creativity. And before we go on, I have a couple of announcements. So next week, we will host a poet, a Pulitzer winning poet, Ray Armantrout. And Ray Armantrout is special because she tries to venture out to different domains when writing poetry. So she collaborates with physicists when she writes her poetry, and she will be talking about her process. She will introduce us to some of her poetry. So I am inviting you all to that talk next week, same place, same time. And after that, we have a couple of more talks, and I would encourage you to grab one of our brochures to get acquainted with who's going to talk and in what topic. And another announcement, if anyone here came for the poetry reading, the poetry reading has moved to another venue, and it's on the 4th floor in the auditorium 4.416. So if any of you is waiting for the poetry reading is on 4th floor. But I don't see anyone moving. Excellent. So I have a great pleasure to introduce one of our faculty members who will introduce our speaker. And Professor Ingrao teaches exploration of the humanities and American literature, with particular focus on literature of the American South. And his research is very diverse. So again, he is in the right place to consider and think and ponder about imagination and creativity, because Professor Ingrao ventures out into his literature studies from studying people like Bruce Springsteen to Batman. So a very broad range of interests. And he's also a recipient of the Regents. He's a nominee for the. Hopefully, he will be the recipient of the Rosa Award. Jay.
Can everyone hear me like this, or is a microphone necessary? Good. Okay, well, thank you, Magda, and thank you all for coming out this evening, for braving the elements on this fine Texas evening that we're having. I'm very honored and privileged to have the opportunity to introduce our speaker this evening, Stephen Asma. Matt Brown is missing out. Stephen Asma has deservedly been described as a polymath. He is professor of philosophy at Columbia College Chicago, where he is also senior fellow of the research group in Mind, Science, and Culture. He is the author of 10 books whose subjects range from the history and philosophy of science to ethics and political philosophy, from the nature of monsters to Buddhism. His recent work synthesizes evolutionary theory, philosophy, cognition, and culture to understand the human mind and its creativity. Asma has written for the New York Times, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Skeptic Magazine, the Sunday Times, the Chicago Tribune, among many, many others. He has also been an agent of cultural and philosophical exchange. In 2003, he was visiting professor at the Buddhist Institute in Phnom Penh, Kingdom of Cambodia. And in 2007, he lived and studied in Shanghai, China. Asma has also researched ancient philosophies in Thailand, Vietnam, Hong Kong, mainland China, and Laos. And in 2014, he was a Fulbright Scholar teaching philosophy in Beijing, China. In addition to all of that, as though that's not enough to make us all envious already, he is also a blues jazz musician, and has played on stage with many musical artists, including Bo Diddley and Buddy Guy. His previous work, especially his work on monsters, has personally been very influential to me. I've incorporated it to great success in my classes, so I thank him for that. And do remember his newest book, The Evolution of Imagination, is available here. We are going to have a signing after he speaks. So I'm going to step aside now, and if you'll please join me in welcoming Stephen Asma.
Thank you very much for that embarrassing introduction, but I now have to live up to it. Can you guys hear me all right if I speak like this, or should I use the mic? I have to go a little longer than
We can hear
so
you.
if my throat gives out on me, I'll turn to the mic.
How about the mic? I'm going
Should I?
to the mic.
All right. Let's do the mic. How's that? Oh, that's good. That's an ego trip for me. I'm going to do some songs on piano next, and no, I'm just kidding. So it's a great honor to be back here. I was here last year, and it's really wonderful to be back. I'm just going to start coming here every year from Chicago, whether you guys invite me or not. Many thanks to the center. It's a wonderful, the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology is doing really great work, and so it's really a privilege to be invited. And for the hospitality from Magda and Jay and Sabrina and Matt. So I think what I'm going to do here is take you guys through a tour of the imagination. It's the imagination is usually about the future, what could be, and it's sort of an engine of utopias and even dystopias. But I want to take you to the past and give you a sense of how the imagination may have actually evolved. There is a reigning paradigm about the mind that is very popular, and if you look at psychology and in philosophy, you'll usually find some version of these assumptions. The idea that the mind is a collection of preset modules. This is very popular. The idea that the mind is a prediction calculator based on Bayesian probability inferences. Don't worry about that, I'll talk about that later. How about the mind as a digital computer? Everybody sort of talks this way. There's hardware, there's software. The mind is produced by language. And finally, many people, professionals working in philosophy and in psychology, talk about the imagination as a kind of folk psychology, that it's not really science. So these are sort of the reigning ideas out there, and I take issue with all of them. And I'm trying to sort of put the imagination back into a position of respect and a place where good research can happen and a respectable sort of feature, or possibly even the core or essence of the mind itself. So what I want to do is start out with a brief taxonomy. What do we mean by imagination? Art and entertainment, free-playing images and narratives. That's the one that I think most of us think of. It's sort of the fantasy generator. Moral intuition pumps. I'm going to go through these more in detail. I just want to give you the list right up front. Scientific intuition pumps, religious representation, and finally this fifth one, which is the faculty of imagination. All of these you're going to be very familiar with, I think, except for maybe the last one, which is what I think philosophers and psychologists are more interested in. And we're going to go through each one of these so you can see what I mean by them. This is the one that I think many of us know and appreciate sort of intuitively, which is the imagination as it plays out in art and entertainment. You guys recognize what's on the left here? Who's this artist? Dali, right? How about on the right? Yeah, Totoro, right? Hayao Miyazaki. Hayao Miyazaki's, many of you guys know his work. He's sort of, I don't know whether calling him the Japanese Walt Disney is an insult or if that's high praise. Take it any way you want. But you can see here that much of the work of the imagination is this kind of composing of counterfactual realities, stuff that does not exist in nature at all, The only place where you can get access to some of this stuff, perhaps on a regular basis, is in dreams. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. So imagination has a lot of work to do in the creativity of the arts, but an area where the imagination is not as well appreciated, I think, is in ethical thinking or moral thinking, moral reflection. Daniel Dennett, philosopher, uses this language, which I like. He says sometimes a good image is like an intuition pump. It forces you to think through certain problems or gets you to focus on ideas in a new way. And here on the left-hand side, you may not recognize, anybody recognize this? This is Charles Dickens on the left-hand side. And Dickens, I think, very famously engaged in imaginative work for moral purposes. Before he was writing, well-known novels, he was writing these sort of pamphlets about the dignity of the poor, and he was trying to hand these out, and nobody was reading them, and nobody was paying attention to him, and so he decided, I'm going to write a novel that shows people the dignity of the poor. And he said it's going to be like a sledgehammer that hits people over the head and wakes them up to this reality, which is what the Christmas Carol turned out to be. He was trying to show the dignity of Tiny Tim and Bob Cratchit and so forth. So there is a strong tradition in the arts which is trying to do moral or ethical work. We won't go into this, but on the right is probably something you're all familiar with, which is the trolley car problem. Are you guys familiar with the trolley car dilemma? Should I turn the trolley car onto the left side and kill just one person, or let it ride and it'll kill these 5 other people? And philosophers use these thought experiments all the time. They're imaginative thought experiments, but the idea is to get you to face certain intuitions that you may have and to complicate those intuitions. So the imagination is at work in moral thinking. Again, it's crucial in scientific thinking too. There is a kind of parody of science, which is that once you've got the hypothetical deductive model, you're just basically drawing inferences from, your some sort of like a syllogistic logic. But in fact, there's a tremendous amount of imagination in science. And I just put 2 very simple examples. It took an enormous act of imagination for Copernicus to think of us not at the center of a geocentric cosmos, but rather in motion around the sun in a heliocentric cosmos. And by using that act of the imagination, he was able to solve this problem of retrograde motion, which is that sometimes when you look up, you'll see like a planet will be stopping and going backwards and then going forward again. And they had no way to understand this because the planets and the heavenly bodies are supposed to be moving in perfect circles, so why would anything back up and move forward again? But of course, if you put yourself on a moving object, what's happening is you are now lapping that other moving object, which makes it look like it's slowing down and stopping and going backwards. And this, as far as I can tell, was a genius act of imagination, and it rarely gets attributed to the imagination. Usually we get this cartoon version of the sciences instead. And here the Turing test, I think, is well known. Here's a thought experiment which people are using to figure out whether or not we've actually arrived at a conscious AI. When would a computer or artificial intelligence achieve enough complexity that we would not be able to tell if it was a machine or a human being? And if it basically fools us, then it passes the Turing test. And this is just exciting to me because it's such an imaginative thought experiment, but we're still, people do the Turing test every year. I think it's at Cambridge, and I think there's one at MIT. So imagination is crucial in the sciences as well. And here also in religious representation, of course, the imagination has a full-time job. And this may be some of the earliest cultural work that the imagination was doing if you think about the evolution of imagination. We're going to come back to this later, but on the left-hand side you see the Hindu deity Kali, and on the right-hand side you have the imaginative symbolic reconstruction of Jesus. And then this is the synthesizing faculty of imagination. So here's the thing that philosophers have been interested in. And people like Aristotle said that the Greek word for imagination is phantasia, and obviously we get the word fantasy from this, but he thought it was something very peculiar. He said, it is, quote, that in virtue of which an image occurs in us. And he thought it was not quite perception, but it's not quite a concept either. It's really in between those two things. And that's something very unique about the imagination, and it even seems to bundle together perceptions and concepts. And this was something that then a modern philosopher, of the Enlightenment period, Kant, followed up with here on the right-hand side. Kant's imagination, this, he said, was the faculty responsible for forming concepts out of the manifold of perceptions and for synthesizing intuitions, perceptions with concepts to form objects which are ready to be judged. I'm going to try to explain what that means here in a moment. The imagination produces virtual representations or mental images. And finally, imagination can be constrained by the understanding, or it can be in free play, unconstrained by causality or purpose, just sort of free associating. And so Kant worked on the imagination, and then nobody in philosophy really looked at the imagination until, again, quite recently. People are starting to look at it finally again. It seemed too complex and too weird, I think, for philosophers, at least of the post-positivist era. So here again, what do we mean by the synthesizing faculty of the imagination? The belief is that the imagination is a cognitive architecture. It's a way of thinking with images. So I listed some of these people, Aristotle, Kant, and then more recently something we're calling embodied cognition, which I gather Mark Johnson was probably talking about last week or so, maybe a couple weeks ago. So how do you marry together the image and the concept? If you look over here, if I say to you, bird, what's the bird you think of? A blue jay? Okay. Why blue jay? Why, what's the connection between thinking of a blue jay and computer science? Okay, that's it. That was totally missing for me, but now that you say it, okay. So that's very idiosyncratic, right, to you and computer science people. I don't think of a blue jay right away because I don't have that same connection. But I don't think of a penguin either. I think of something like a robin or something like this, really generic bird. Was anybody thinking like ostrich? Probably not. That's rather distant. What happens is that we have concepts like bird, but they're really sort of like a prototype concept. You think of like a defining image in your head, like you get an image of like a robin, and then all other birds are sort of connected to that. Imagine like radial spokes coming off of this central bird. And you know as soon as I give these other birds that they're birds as well, but you're still using an image in a sense to conceptualize birds. And you can see whether or not these other birds are going to fit into your category or not. So categorizing nature and the world is partly conceptual and partly image-based. And this was the thing that philosophers got all excited about. We'll continue with that too, but I want to give you a sense of why the evolution of imagination is so important, I think, to the kind of minds we ended up having. I'm going to suggest that the crucial idea is one of decoupling. So if you imagine like a really early human being, a Homo erectus, or probably an Australopithecus, or for that matter, if you're just thinking about chimpanzees, what's happening for the most part is they're perceiving something. Let's say it's a big cat, it's a leopard, it's a cheetah, doesn't matter what it is, a tree. And the perception then is wedded to the actual experience that you're having. But at some point, these images get decoupled from your actual, experience in the here and now, and you're able to sort of store them as memories. And this is a really important development in the evolution of mind, because only when you can store images and sort of perceptions can you then start to manipulate them later, and you begin to have an imagination once you have this power. So what are the ways in which we begin this decoupling process of having like offline images? One of the crucial areas I think is dreams, because I think this is sort of an interesting debate, like, do you think animals are dreaming? It depends on who you ask, but the tradition historically thought that animals didn't have an interior mental life until Darwin came along and said, yeah, you should look more closely. And you see dogs, like, you ever see a dog like running in its sleep? You've seen this, right? So Darwin also pointed to these things and said that it appears to be that animals are dreaming. But what's happening in a dream is the animal must be taking this storage of representations or images and then essentially both writing a narrative and reading the narrative at the same time. It's a really peculiar thing that's happening when you're dreaming, because you're in it like it's reality, but you're also composing it. And the only way for that to happen is if you've got some kind of free play of these decoupled images. And the question that's of interest to us is, when do you get this developmentally, and what other animals have it? There's some evidence, for example, that kids under 5 do not have REM dreams. And that has led some theorists recently to suggest that you need to get language on board before you have dreams. I think this is probably wrong, because I think the images themselves can basically be a part of narrative even before language. But obviously memory is the storage of these images, and then very importantly, simulations. Like, a lot of imaginative play is sort of one animal simulating another animal. And it turns out that all of this research that's coming out now on mirror neurons is also sort of validating that you have a way in which your body can directly simulate another body, which is how basically dance probably evolved. You make certain motions and I can make the same motions. And essentially this kind of simulation and fragmenting simulation into routines and then adding like another routine onto another routine is how you develop dance. But other kinds of social activities that are cooperative, at drumming, staying on the same beat even. Turns out most animals can't do this. It's called entrainment. And human beings are very easy to all lock in. Like, if I clap, eventually everybody here can do the same beat with me. But most other animals cannot do this. Another idea is task grammar. Many people think you need to have language evolve in order to have an imagination, because language gives you the grammar that then you can slot the images into. But actually, I think there's kind of body grammar. And you see this in the way in which animals prepare their food. There's a sequence of steps which they learn and they have to master. And this is a kind of task grammar. So, for example, the great apes are very good at, these gorillas, mountain gorillas like in Rwanda, they eat, I had the very good fortune to go and see them in their natural habitat, and you have to hike through these, up this mountain. We ended up in the Congo, and we had to wear gloves because everywhere are these really spiky nettles that stab your hands, and they're basically like a leaf with a bunch of like thorns the size of hairs all over them. And not only do they hurt like hell, but they itch really bad too. And this is the gorilla's main food supply. So what it does is it takes this nettle and it has a folding process whereby it folds all the actual barbs inside, and then it puts it in its mouth, and then it eats it, so that it doesn't stab its mouth all with these nettles. And so what I think is happening is that primates in particular are very good at sequencing behavioral routines and then putting subroutines within larger routines. And this is kind of a predecessor to grammar, I think. And then, of course, lastly, the obvious one is language, which is able to think of, talk about a fire, or to talk about a leopard or a threat by using linguistic symbols. And this is probably the greatest form of decoupling, because, if you think about language, probably the early forms of language would have been sort of onomatopoeia, where you have a snake and then you probably like try to represent it by making the sound like tss. But eventually language creates decoupled symbols that have nothing to do with the actual animal, and we know what they mean by convention. So that's a long way to go. That's quite a distance of decoupling of representations. Now Darwin says In The Descent of Man, he says, the imagination is one of the highest prerogatives of man. By this faculty, he unites former images and ideas independently of the will, and thus creates brilliant and novel results. Dreaming gives us the best notion of this power. As poet Jean-Paul says, the dream is an involuntary art of poetry. And I love this quote because it also suggests that the imagination has these two phases. It has the voluntary phase that we're familiar with when you sit down to write a poem or to write a screenplay or to draw the cat bus from Hayao Miyazaki's film. That's voluntary. You can bring those kinds of imaginative images under a kind of executive control. But there's also an involuntary form of imagination where images are just free-floating and associating one after the other. And that's really, not only is that something we can access in dreams, but also my suggestion is that the early mind of mammals may have been more like this before we had executive control per se. As dogs, cats, horses, and probably all the higher animals, even birds, have vivid dreams, and this is shown by their movements and the sounds uttered, we must admit that they possess some power of imagination. So there again is Darwin is essentially 1872, and it's a very scandalous thing to say at that time because there was still a huge divide between the animals and the animals and the human. And so here, the dreaming brain, we see some fairly interesting stuff happen that is very much like creativity as we know it. Serotonin drops in the dreaming brain, and it has been noticed that it also drops in some forms of creativity. So people have noticed that even the neurochemistry of dreaming and creativity has certain, if not parallels, it might in fact just be the same process. Secondly, prefrontal cortex turns off and the limbic system turns up. So the old mammal brain, which is where emotion and memory is processed, is usually alive and kicking while you're asleep. But some of the more frontal and neocortical, particularly the prefrontal cortex, quiets down when you go to sleep. So it's almost like in the evening you're having this involuntary artistic experience every time you dream. Now, how could such dreaming and sort of image manipulation be adaptive? Like, how could this have evolved? It has to be useful to the organism, otherwise it's just, it's going to be either edited out by natural selection, or it's just a kind of a cheesecake that just comes along with having a big brain, which might be true, but I don't think so. These are the things that it can do. I won't go through this in detail, but if you're interested in the book, I go through this in detail and show you why it's sort of valuable to be able to do dreaming work. And I'll just summarize it with a couple of quick points. We think dreaming might be doing one of a number of things. It might be the way in which your brain sort of takes out the garbage. You dump information that is not going to be useful to you on a daily basis. That's one theory. The other is sort of the opposite theory, which is that in the dream you are sort of, this is called the burn-in theory. It's like you're burning in particular memories and sort of soft wiring, maybe action tendencies. And the way this is done would be something like, let's say let's say you get a new job and you have a new boss, and he's kind of a jerk, and you have a lot of anxiety, and you're having dreams about how to handle him. One argument is what's happening is you're consolidating your emotions and behavioral patterns with regard to your boss, so that then in waking life, you have almost like some ready default behaviors. You know how to organize your experience better because you've been tagging it in your dream with affective or emotional tags. So this theory has gotten a lot of play lately, and it would, if it turns out to be true, would lend a lot of credence to the idea that dreams can be adaptive because they're helping you prepare for waking life. They're basically like virtual reality scenarios for you. So this is the idea that dreaming is intensified mind wandering is also a relatively new idea, but it looks like this is being increasingly corroborated by empirical work. The DMN is a fancy word for, it's called the default mode network. And it's when your brain goes into a state that is more associational. You're relaxed, you're not focused on a particular task, you're basically mind wandering. It's like when you're looking out the window in school and you're supposed to be paying attention and you're just imagining one thing after another. The mind is sort of in free fall. And it looks like the state of REM and this brainstorming phenomenon of just letting your mind wander looks very similar. This data is brand new and it might turn out to be wrong, but it's kind of exciting for those of us who are interested in this topic because it means that when you are trying to sort of brainstorm new ideas, your mind is actually going into a sort of waking dream mode, even, momentarily. And what's interesting about this is that I think, and we were talking earlier, Magda and I, at dinner, your brain is toggling between this mode and then this more task-positive network, which has to put these free associations into a particular direction. So, for example, my brother is an editor in Hollywood, and he has an editing house that it's very successful. So, like, you go to the movies and you see the trailer for the next movie that's coming, like, in a few months. Half the trailers you see, my brother's company makes. I mean, he gets these amazing accounts. Like, did you see that Stephen King movie, It? Did you see the ad for it? The ad scared the crap out of me. It won all these awards, like went totally viral. So they made the trailer for it. So this is the kind of stuff he does. But I was talking to him about this, and he said, yeah, he runs this company, and it's all these creative people. They're all very imaginative. And he said, sometimes the really creative people are good at this kind of brainstorming stuff, but they cannot get it together into any kind of useful format. So he has another set of team that acts as the editors. And the editors take all this mishmash of great ideas that the creatives are throwing, and they go, that's a bad idea, that's a good one, that's a bad one, that's a bad one, that's a good one. And it's almost like he's got a division of labor within this creative trailer house, essentially, for generating the best kind of product. And he's got it separated into the really associational minds and then the more editorial minds. And what we think is actually happening is you have this as well within your own mind. Just some of us have, like, one side is stronger than the other. Some of us are more the daydreamer types, and some of us are more task-oriented. So this is just some brain porn for you, because a talk like this really has to have some. And if you'll see on the left-hand side, you'll see what the task-positive network looks like. I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but on the right-hand side, you'll see that it has a different sort of fingerprint or signature of a brain activity. The default mode network, or mind watering, is here on the right-hand side. And as far as we can tell, you're able to shift very quickly back and forth between these two things and cycle through them. In fact, some people have suggested that one of the things they say might be good for your creativity is to get off your damn phone because the phone keeps putting you, like, constantly in task-positive network. You're always like, it's going to be a great email coming or text. I know it, what's on my Facebook feed. And you're just constantly engaged in some kind of purposeful task. And this rarely lets your mind just go slack and into this default mode network, which is really crucial for imaginative work or creativity. So that's one of the things that people are suggesting as a result of some of this research might be practically good. Here is then this idea that I think is really important for understanding the imagination, which is this is a transient hypofrontality is a way of saying, like, momentarily transient or in passing, you have less frontality. So if you look at your brain, you'll see that this sort of little brain in the back is your cerebellum, and so the brain is facing this way, right? So right above your eyes is the orbital frontal cortex, and right above that you'll see this DLPFC, right? This is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which in this drawing is actually not even in the right place, so don't, don't take this too seriously. That's the problem with some of this work. But what we think is happening, and what we now have evidence for, is that when you're engaged in certain kinds of creative or imaginative work, that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex goes quiet. And we think that in many ways that part of your brain is almost like a brake. It's like an editor, part of the executive function. It's always sort of vigilantly planning and watching your thoughts. But if you can shut it up or cancel it down or quiet it, then these more associational parts of aspects of thinking start to come to the fore. And there's even some recent empirical evidence that if you put one of these transcranial magnets on the dorsolateral frontal cortex and you zap it so that it basically, there's not as much blood going to that region, there's not as much synaptic activity, the result is that people tend to be better at creative problem solving like 15 minutes later. And this test suggests that indeed there's something about this part of the brain when it's on, it's keeping you sort of thinking in these rehearsed logical patterns that you're used to, but if you turn it off, your mind will go into more novel problem solving and associational types of networks. So this is all based on recent MRI stuff, but of course artists have known about this for a long time. And this is I think this is the last brain image I'm going to show you. But this is really exciting, I think, to many of us. How many people here are musicians? Anybody's a musician? Okay, a number of people. So this was a study done by Charles Lim, and he put people in an fMRI machine, and he even built a keyboard for them. So you're laying on your back in this machine, your brain is being scanned, and you can play a keyboard. And what he noticed was that if he had classical musicians play classical music, the frontal part of the brain, especially the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, was on and was awake and very strong and processing this musical behavior. But if he had jazz musicians come in and play jazz, that part of the brain goes quiet. And the part of the medial frontal cortex actually becomes more activated, which is what you're seeing here. So this is an improviser. And his interpretation of this, again, this is pretty new stuff, so we're not sure, but his interpretation of it is what's happening is the improviser is getting that break to basically, turn off, is relaxing it, and then some of these more novel pathways are coming to the fore, so that as you're exercising new musical ideas, you're basically in this more associational mind, like the default mode network. So he's also had this done on rappers, so people who are like reciting maybe a preset memorized poem versus somebody who's freestyling. And if somebody does freestyle rap, they start a rhyme and they don't know how it's going to end. So they're looking at what are the parts of the brain that are being employed, and it turns out it's a lot like these default mode networks. Now, artists have been doing disengaging the break, of course, for thousands of years. And on the left here, you see some French artist in a cafe who's been drinking too much absinthe. And this is Lady Absinthe here, this green creature. I don't know if you've had any absinthe, but it's legal again. And I highly recommend it. It's really good. But of course, artists will frequently turn to intoxicants as a way. Let's set aside people who use intoxicants for purposes of just like trying to get through a show. A lot of artists use intoxicants as a way to sort of juice their creativity, rightly or wrongly. And one of the things that we think may be happening is that it is in fact also compromising this frontality, this front part of the brain, and then allowing these more creative juices to flow. Some of this is sheer romanticism, but some of it seems to be legit. Maybe a couple of drinks, but not, don't go the Jimi Hendrix route. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, you don't have to get drunk or wasted or high to be creative. Nature, according to the Romantic period, was a way in which to not only sort of commune with everything, but also to sort of engage your creativity. So many people use nature as a way to set aside the pragmatic utilitarian mindset and allow these more creative pathways to emerge. And people use all kinds of stuff. I was just reading an article on Woody Allen, who apparently takes like 2-hour-long showers, because while he's standing in the hot shower, that's when like all the problems of his life go away, and then all these creative ideas can emerge, and that's how he writes most of his movies. So just so you know, you might want to take longer showers. All right, imagination as embodied cognition. Now, this is where we're at today. We had these long traditions of artists trying to manipulate their brain and manipulate their minds, but finally, cognitive scientists, philosophers, and psychologists are starting to look at this more carefully. And I'm suggesting that the imagination is a pre-linguistic, pre-propositional meaning system. So we know a lot about the world, we investigate the world through the imagination. It's not just for fantasy, it's not just for art. Many of us are using the imagination just to get through the day, but we don't recognize that's what we're doing because we're oftentimes creating virtual reality scenarios. Virtual reality scenarios help us to do sort of predictive processing. And many people have suggested that this is really the core of what it means to have a mind. How does it do it? It does it via these, what's now called 4E, which is that the mind is embodied, extended, embedded, and inactive. So what does this mean? It's embodied in the sense that my body knows how to solve certain problems, social problems. I come into a room and right away I can tell that there's hostility or there's friendlies. And I don't even need to sort of inferentially calculate that out. My body's able to read your body pretty quickly. We're starting to sort of appreciate this better, I think, in cognitive science circles. This is an interesting one. The mind is also extended. A lot of people think of the mind as just in your head, but of course, a lot of your mind is right in here. And like literally, a lot of your problem-solving skills have been offloaded to our technologies. So most of us don't read maps anymore or navigate by dead reckoning. We just Google map it and then just follow whatever the tech tells us. And we can't remember anything anymore. We don't have memory palaces like the medievals had. We just put it in our phone or whatever. So the memory's been offloaded too into technology. And in that sense, the mind is extended outside the actual, the head. You're always embedded in a social environment and a physical environment, and the mind often only makes sense within those environments. What we know, for example, is, this actually happened with my own grandmother. Oftentimes if you take an elderly person who's lived in the same house for a very long time, and they may be having some kind of illness or they may be compromised, and you want to move them to a hospital that we think might be safer for them, oftentimes the person goes dramatically downhill. Cognitively, they go down very, very fast. And what we think might be happening is that somebody who's lived in the same house for decades has so much of their own mind distributed through the house that if you take them out of that embedded situation, their mind does not have the kind of structure and sequential nature that it ordinarily has. In other words, if you wake up and you see, there's your kitchen, and that means, then over to breakfast, and then after breakfast, your house almost reminds you of the next thing you're supposed to do. But if you're ripped out of that situation, oftentimes your cognition becomes very compromised. So, and lastly, the mind is always not just a spectator of ideas and representation, but it's always involved in action. Usually that's what the mind is for. So how does all this happen? It happens through images, metaphors, emotions, and so forth. Now, what I think is really interesting here is you can see that one of the things that's unique about the imagination is, and this is something that Aristotle saw, this is something Kant saw, is that the imagination is so emotional. It's not just a concept. Like I don't just say cat or dog or spider. The imagination is really already loaded with affective feelings. So if you see a spider, or if I say spider, oftentimes emotions or feelings are basically coming along with the concept or the percept. And this is sort of an exciting area that I've been doing research in lately. I put these people down here below if you want to do more research on it. These are some really good psychologists who've been doing work on the emotions. But even basic thinking is very contoured by feeling and emotion. So how many people are nervous about spiders? It's one of the great phobias. So, okay, a lot of you are nervous about spiders. It's not a neutral perception when you see a spider. And if I talk about spiders, some of you even when you get the thing on the back of your neck or whatever. So one of the things about imaginative thinking is it's not like math. The imagination is using images and representations that have affect or emotion built into them. So when you're writing a story or you're basically creating a poem, you're using representations that already come loaded with emotions. That's why poetry works so well. And this is just an area that I think is not had enough attention, and I'm hoping that it will get more attention in the future. Thinking with the imagination is a very flexible system. It's associational and emotional, like I said. It's a simulation as knowledge. This is sort of an interesting issue. A lot of people, particularly in the sciences, think that knowledge happens in the sciences. So what's happening in the arts? If knowledge is scientific, art must be like entertainment or window dressing. It's just superfluous compared to knowledge. But this is to have a very, I think, impoverished notion of knowledge. Oftentimes what we're doing when we're reading a novel is we are in fact learning something about human behavior, human character, human motivations. If you want to understand people better, don't really take a psych class, no offense to the psych professors. Read Dostoevsky, right? I mean, that's how you learn a lot about how human beings are. So there's a sense in which imaginative work like literature and music is also a kind of knowledge, but it hasn't been really respected as such. It's sort of been put to the side. And I just think this is the wrong model of knowledge. All right. There seems to be these two systems in the brain, too, that are sometimes called hot and cold cognition. And what I'm interested in here is, let me sort of define these very briefly. There's a sense in which your brain and your psyche has a very fast problem-solving machine, essentially, which we would call the hot cognition system. So if I throw some kind of threat at you, your body knows what to do immediately. It's sort of instinctual, right? But you also have what's called cold cognition, which is you have the ability to stop and calculate and think about how to solve a problem. And what we think happened is that the hot cognition system is very old and ancient, and we share that system with all mammals for the most part, probably a lot of vertebrates, really. But the cold cognition system is something that requires a kind of higher level consciousness, at least the kind of elaborate symbol systems like language and also self-consciousness. It's an interesting question, what animals have a concept of self? Have you heard about this test where the animal's asleep and you paint a dot on its forehead? Have some of you guys heard this? You put a mirror in the cage, the animal's asleep, you put a dot on its forehead, and then you wait for the animal to wake up and go into the mirror, and if the animal just stares at itself, the way they interpret this is that it doesn't have a concept of self because it just sees this thing in the mirror. But if the animal looks at itself in a mirror and then goes like this, it indicates the self-concept, right? Because it sees that thing as itself, and therefore that marking I see there is actually on my head. Fairly high level kind of cognition. I mean, that test is also has been challenged dramatically too. But it's interesting because some animals you think would pass it don't, and other animals you think would not pass it do. So where self-consciousness arises is a really interesting question. But clearly, self-consciousness is involved in cold cognition. It helps you solve problems by slow, rational inferences. Now, imagination works in both systems. When it's working in the hot cognition system, I'm calling it improvisation. So does anybody do any kind of improvisation, like in music or in comedy or theater? Okay. Everybody really improvises. We don't recognize it as such, but in daily life, we're always improvising. Try parenting, It's just there's just no book for that. And there are books, but they're useless. You're constantly improvising. But what's happening in improvisation is, as a musician, I've done a lot of this, and it's very interesting and it's very quirky, but you are solving problems that are adaptive in the musical environment. Like if we're playing a jazz piece, and you say, okay, Steve, hit it, take the chorus, play. I've got to be in tune. I've got to be, if we're in the minor key, I've got to be in the minor key. I've got to use the chord, colorations that are happening in this musical environment, but also I can really make up something that's new as well. And that's exciting because it's a kind of imagination that's happening very fast in real time. So you're doing this kind of simultaneous composition and performance. Whereas in many other imaginative works, you do the composition first and then you do the performance later, right? But in improvisation, you're doing both at the same time. And my view is that we all have this capacity, but it oftentimes gets clouded or obscured by these slower thinking processes. And it's only in certain scenarios, like in jazz improvisation or so forth, where you can reconnect to it. But my own sense is that that is probably what involuntary imagination is. And then slowly, as the mind evolved, we got more and more control over that process, and we were able to shape it towards specific goals through cold cognition. So I want to take you guys through I'm going to do this very quickly, and then I want to hear what you guys have to say, take questions, and have discussion. I want to just show you a couple of really fundamental moves, I think, that happen in the evolution of imagination. And a year ago, I sort of introduced this idea when I was here, but I've done a lot of thinking about it since then, and it's kind of fun to come back to it here. One of the things we notice about imaginative culture, the history of imaginative culture, is some of the earliest forms of it are what? Religion. And lo and behold, in almost every religion, and certainly in some of the earliest literature we have, there are these hybrids where you're pasting together two different things. Could be zoological, you're pasting two animals together like the Greek hybrids, the chimeras, or an elephant head and a body. I was looking at Gilgamesh, which is obviously very, very old, and there you have a hybrid of a lion and a man in the monster of Humbaba. Even like some of the earliest sculptures we have from the Upper Paleolithic period seem to be a combination of like a dog and a man. And so hybrids seem to be something that we're able to do. Like once you get those images decoupled from real time into memory storage, then dreams can start pasting them together. And the imaginative life of literature and cave art and eventually religion seems to be doing that very early on, just pasting these things together and creating supernatural creatures. Why are these interesting? Because they're sticky memes. Just like you get a meme on your phone and it's totally hilarious and then you send it to all your friends, it's because there's something, it has some quality that makes it sticky. And if you look at religious iconography, imaginative work is designed to be sticky because it will, like any other meme, it will travel quickly through the culture. And this is what you need in order to get a religion going. And it unifies people around these images. So there's a reason why there's so many hybrids appearing in early culture, I think. Here's just some other examples of how you do it. You can hybridize by multiplying parts. You can hybridize by blending these taxonomic categories. You can hybridize by just domain crossing, putting one animal into a totally different domain where it shouldn't belong. You can blend metaphysical categories. It's supposed to be dead, but it's alive. And so early imaginative work all has these qualities. This is the cognitive architecture of the imagination, and I'll let you, if you're interested, I'll let you sort of go through that in the book. I won't go through it here because we don't have time. I'll finish up by taking us back to the Paleolithic period. If imagination is an illusion maker, namely it generates these counterfactuals, things that aren't real, then why do we have it? And one theory, as I was suggesting earlier, sort of made famous by Steven Pinker, was that things like music and art are these kind of cheesecakes, he thinks. Like if you just have a really good information processor between your ears, you get things like art as just a sort of evolutionary byproduct, but it wasn't selected for. I think he's wrong about that, and I think that the imagination really is highly adaptive. And here on the right-hand side, you see the kind of tools that were, this is later than the Upper Paleolithic, but tool making and tool innovation is some of our earliest imaginative work. Who would have been the early virtuosos of the imagination? It would have been the shaman, and of course then the technical innovators. So if you look at the Upper Paleolithic, this is when culture suddenly has an explosion that you all recognize. This is the time of the cave paintings. This is the time when we first begin to find like flutes and other sort of decorative jewelry and so forth. So many people have suggested that there's either something happens to the brain or something happens to the culture that puts imagination sort of into overdrive during this period. Finally, the imagination is essentially a trial and error problem solving, generate and test sort of mechanism. Among all the other things that it can do, it can overcome the tyranny of the here and now. In other words, it's what allowed us to become the goal-directed animal. Many animals, sometimes you look at your cat and you're like, I wish I was my cat because life is so blissful compared to our lives. But really, there's not much future in an animal's mind. They don't project the future. They're not burdened by mind, but also they're trapped in the here and now. And one of the things about imagination is that it decouples from the here and now and gives you a second universe. That second universe exists only in your head and in these embodied forms I've been talking about, but you don't see it per se. And that's something that human beings have that other creatures either lack entirely or have only in a very small degree. That's probably a good place to draw my formal comments to a close. I'll stop there and then hear what you guys want to talk about. So thank you.
So the way we'll be doing it, anybody who would like to raise a question, please raise your hand and I'll come up with the mic.
First, thank you so much for coming, BD Alice, and delivering this amazing talk. On a side note, I'm going to get blasted by transcranial magnetic stimulation tomorrow morning, actually. So hopefully, if they hit the right places, I can be able to solve some creative problems. But my question is, given that mindfulness meditation can reduce activation in the default mode network, do you think that would decrease creativity, or and also do you have any experience with meditation at all, given that you study Buddhism and Eastern cultures?
Yeah, okay, good. I'll start with the second point you were asking about. This is an interesting question because meditation is also another way. I didn't put it up there, right? I mean, I put on it, this tells you a lot about me, I put on intoxication, but not meditation. But it's a way in which people for a very long time have been trying to access these other aspects of mind, the ones that aren't sort of everyday pragmatic forms of mind. And Buddhism, the Buddha tried the yoga techniques that were common in Vedantic Hinduism, which is that you clear your mind and then you attempt to clear the discursive thought of language, sort of talking to yourself. And then, according to this model, you're supposed to move through these trance states all the way to these very high levels of abstraction. And he mastered this technique, but he thought it didn't really help him solve the problem of suffering, which is what he wanted to solve. So instead, he said, I'm going to do a simpler kind of meditation, which is, the Pali word is sati, and it basically translates as mindfulness, right? So that's much simpler than this Hindu version. You still clear the mind, and you try to clear that discursive element, but then there's a question about what's happening at that point. Like, are you just blank? Are you just empty? And sometimes you are. I've done, a fair amount of meditating myself, although I'm just still like, I'm in the baby pool compared to, these great masters. And sometimes the mind goes really clear and quiet, and other times you're able to just see your thoughts or feelings and just observe them as they pass through consciousness without clinging to them or being sort of pushed around by them. And that's one of the great goals of mindfulness, is to observe your own mind from this kind of clinical detachment, because it's really healthy to do this. So what does this have to do with creativity? It's interesting because the Zen tradition, as you know, in Buddhism, tries to get this really quieted state of mind, right before you engage in some creative act, like a calligraphy, let's say, or let's say a painting of some kind, or even the tea ceremony. And so it seems to me that the meditator must be going into some of these brain systems, but I don't know which ones. Like, I would think the default mode network, but there's some data that suggests that actually the really good meditators, some of these Tibetan monks who meditate like all day long, they're in the task positive network, much more than the default mode network. But I think there's going to be data coming on this. Like, there's more and more research happening on this, and I think it's exciting. But I don't think there's any clear picture yet. Yeah.
You said that it's possible. You talked about hot thinking and cold thinking, and that you said imagination might be adaptive or a byproduct. And you said that Pinker says that it might be a byproduct, and that you don't quite agree with that. Why not? And is it possible that, I don't understand, so that's why I'm asking, is it possible that maybe imagination, the hot type of thinking, the innovative thinking, precedes logical thinking, cold type thinking?
Yeah, good. That's my argument in the book, is that hot cognition is very old. It's been under construction all through the mammalian evolution, which is approximately 200 million years. Whereas cold cognition is probably, you can mark it from the development of anatomically modern humans, which would be only 200,000 years old. So 200 million versus 200,000 years. So I think that our minds are largely hot cognition systems with this little veneer of cold cognition on top. But an important veneer that changes the hot cognition system. So yes, that's generally my view, is that the hot cognition is a larger part of our phylogenetic past. As for Pinker and cheesecake, I believe he said this about music in particular, but then he applied it to the arts as well. He thinks they're not adaptive, but there's so many reasons why creativity and imagination are adaptive. One is, what I was trying to suggest here, is that you use it as a way to predict what could happen. So you use your imagination, what's that predator going to do? And in a sense, this could really be the difference between whether you survive or not. So it seems to me that imaginative work models reality, possible realities. Without imagination, how do you learn anything? You have to actually get hit or fall down or almost die before you learn from experience, because that's how conditioning works. But with an imagination, you can actually watch somebody else get hurt, and then benefit and learn as a result of it, or you can even imagine a scenario and save yourself. So I think imagination is adaptive in those senses, but also what he's forgetting about is sexual selection. Being good at imaginative work or being creative makes you sexy. And that means you have the potential to procreate when others may not. So it's just like any other form of sexual selection, just like having like really big muscles or some crazy adornment fin on your head. You know, these birds dance for each other and so forth. I think for humans, imagination is a large part of sexual selection too. So in that sense, it's not cheesecake. It really helps you further your genes. Yeah.
You were explaining how emotion and feelings are a huge part of how humans interact with their imagination. And we were discussing how animals and self-identification or self-awareness in that way. The documentary Blackfish, in regards to killer whales, I think it was the hypothalamus that they were discussing. They have a larger part in their brain that the same feeling receptor and center than humans do. So do you in those regards think that animals will also have an evolution of imagination, as well as could killer whales be almost in our level of cognitive thinking, I guess is?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I know that I've seen bits and pieces of that documentary, and I know it's had a lot of influence. So there's a power of documentary for you. But yes, I had heard this too, that the cetaceans generally have larger, relatively speaking, larger hippocampi, which is where a lot of memory processing happens. And so this would apply to dolphins and killer whales and I suppose like dugongs and stuff like this. And I don't know why that is really. Like maybe it has to do with special navigation problems that you have to deal with in the open waters that they live in, because you've got to be able to figure out where you are and get to areas like for breeding and so forth. But it seems to me that at some point, and they have, of course, they have a language, they have a communication system where you can tell another pod of killer whales, hey, we're over here, you know, or avoid this area or something. But we also have to remember, we have a tendency to anthropomorphize animals. It's still a very impoverished communication system compared to like the sentence I'm saying right now, right? There's just all these meta levels that language can go to. I can embed like a clause inside a clause, inside a clause, inside a clause, and animals don't appear to have that ability. So it means there's probably a ceiling on their imaginative abilities. That's not to say they don't have imaginations. I think they do, because I think they can do the kind of dream narratives that we were talking about earlier. But I think the levels of imagination that we do, literature and just contemplating like your own existential, you know, condition, is such an imaginative act that's at such a high level that I very much doubt that most animals can do it. They're locked more in the here and now.
Okay, so my question is, so if imagination is one of our earliest forms of embodied cognition, how do you relate that to, I guess, cognitive impairments found with deficit or hyperactivity disorder?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, you may know more on this than I do, but my understanding of one of the dominant theories about attention deficit disorder is that it's not that how to put this exactly? It's the idea that here's a paradoxical thing, and my mom's a nurse and she knew this like 20, 30 years ago. She said they used to give hyperactive kids like Mountain Dew, which seems like the worst idea ever, doesn't it? Like give a hyperactive kid Mountain Dew. But the reason why they think this works, and this is why some of the medications are kind of like uppers in a way, and yet they calm the child, is that the argument is that there's something about the frontal cortex which is down-tuned compared to sort of neurotypical brains. And what you need is something and so what's happening in the attention deficit disorder kid is he or she is trying to stimulate themselves through like physical things and moving and sort of hyperactivity, because this frontal area is down too low. When you add certain activities or wake it up, then the child calms down. So my suspicion is that the research in those areas is probably going to dovetail. If this is right, then it makes sense with that too, because we're talking about sort of dialing in a part of the brain that really controls these sort of executive functions. And sometimes it's dialed down, and sometimes it's dialed up too high, and sometimes it's not enough. So I think we're just at the beginning of learning this stuff. There is some interesting research on animals and on humans. This is going to sound sort of Dr. Frankenstein to you, but they've taken rats and they decorticate them, which means you remove the cortex, which is that more recent layer of the brain that we think is more involved in thinking and decision making. And they've left the limbic brain and the sort of reptile complex below. And strangely enough, you'd think the animal would go to pieces if you remove its cortex, and it doesn't. It feeds, it suckles, it plays, it has an emotional life that sort of makes sense. And then, sadly, every once in a while, a human child is born with very little cortex as well. And there again, what you find is a child that has an emotional life that can be very sophisticated, even though they're not doing the sort of linguistic thinking that a neurotypical person is. So again, it suggests to me that there are layers of mind that correlate with brain areas, and that it's somehow the communication between these is part of things like imagination and other things.
Okay, so my first question would be, what would be some of the brain waves as measured during innovative thinking, and especially in respect to meditation and default mode network activation decrease, and also in regards to meditation, do you know how task positive central executive network behaves? And I would also like to give one comment in respect to the so-called mirror test that you referenced as a way to establish whether certain members of animal kingdom indeed have that metacognitive and self-identity kind of notion. That test is by far and large failed itself at actually standing on adequate metacognitive assumptions in order to measure or try to capture any sort of metacognition, metacognitive capacity. So yes.
Yeah, I'm aware of the criticisms of the test, and it only works if you make a lot of interpretive assumptions that we probably shouldn't be making. As for the task positive network and meditation, there again, there are studies that show that the person to look at for this, if you want to see like really good work on it, is probably Richie Davidson at Madison, who is one of the framers, together with Jaak Panksepp, of affective neuroscience. And he's the guy that, you guys maybe remember this, the Dalai Lama met with a bunch of brain scientists, and one of the things, of course they hook up all these meditators and they sort of look at their brains while they're meditating, but one of the things the Dalai Lama said was, to Richie Davidson, was, why is so much psychology about pathology? Why is it always so about how the system goes wrong? Why don't you guys do some studies of happiness? And this sort of started this tradition that now is in full flow, which is a sort of happiness psychology. But Richie Davidson has done a lot of good work analyzing the brains of meditators, and I refer you to his stuff. According to the stuff I've read, which is also, I have to say, quick story. What he wanted to do was get as many meditators as possible to get their brains scanned while they were meditating. But the problem was that when he went to Dharamsala and he asked, or there's places in the United States too where there's a lot of Tibetan meditators, and he talked to them about the brain science, he made the mistake of saying that he didn't really believe in karma and reincarnation. And the Buddhist monks were like, well, we're not working with you, because they didn't want to work with just a thoroughly secular scientific study. So he ended up finding this guy, Matthew Ricard, who's very famous, And the problem with this, a lot of this work is most of it's based on a very small data set. Much of it is based on that guy, Matthew Ricard. So there's a sense in which you should take this with a grain of salt, but apparently the work that, that they've done has shown that when the meditator is in very intensive meditation, they're more often in the task positive network than the default mode network. Why that is, I don't know. Except to say that meditating is not about relaxing and in being comfortable. It's a very strenuous, if you're really doing it right, it's extremely strenuous way of bringing your mind into the present moment such that you aren't thinking about, there's no ideation about the past, no ideation or desires about the future. In order to hold yourself in the present moment, it must be cognitively demanding, that's my assumption.
Thank you very much for an excellent talk.
Thank you.